Hey guys, my name's Andrew Gierczak, head of brewery operations and head brewer for MobCraft, and I'm here to talk to you about mashing.
This is the Brewery series. Welcome to MobCraft.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is mashing, and one of the important things I always like to think about it as there's an old ism in the brewing industry, and that's that the only difference between bread and beer is how much water you add. Beer is literally liquid bread. In fact, as far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, this is literally the case. Their bakeries and their breweries were actually the same building, and the only difference between the two as far as the ancient Egyptians was concerned was how much water they added. If they were making bread, they'd add a little less water. If they were making beer, they'd add a little more water. Mashing is essentially the very first step in the brewing process. It's the part where we add hot water and we mix it with our malt that's been crushed in a mill. This is important because this is the step where we actually extract sugars from the grain, which is what the yeast is going to use to actually ferment the beer. So it's really all about creating a sugar-rich solution, which we call wort. Here at MobCraft, we get most of our malts, actually about 97% of them are actually sourced right here within the state. We get some of them from Malt Europe, which is located right here in Milwaukee, and then we also get some from, we get all of our specialty malts from Brewery, which is located up in Chilton, Wisconsin, and then we'll maybe source 3% of our malts as imported malts, depending on where they're coming from, and depending on what style of beer. Malt is basically barley, or for that matter, any cereal crop that has undergone a sprouting process. They basically maximize the sprouting process for sugar production, and then they kill it off about 5 to 7 days into the germination of the plant, and then they dry it down, remove all the moisture, and essentially biologically inactivate all the enzymes. They don't kill them. From that point, they'll actually subject the barley to a variety of different roasting or kilning procedures, which gives you all the different types of malts. For example, this is an example of a malt that's actually roasted just like coffee in a drum roaster. It's called roasted barley, and unsurprisingly, it actually gives a lot of the same flavors as coffee or dark chocolate. This is what will lend color to stouts and roasted character to darker beers. This is another fascinating malt right here. This is called crystal malt. It's so named because it actually forms little caramelized pieces of sugar inside the barley kernel. What they'll do is they'll actually stew the grains, which means they'll convert all the starch to sugar inside the barley kernel, and then they'll kiln that, and all the sugars inside caramelize, and you get a nice, tasty product. The third major type of malt that we use here is just regular plain old base malt. And the base malt is basically as close as you can get to the raw barley product. They basically, once the barley's been germinated, they'll dry it down and they'll roast it or kiln it, and then this is the base malt that we get. Once the grain arrives here from our maltsters, we need to weigh it out. Second part is crushing it, and what that crushing does is basically that crushing crushes the grain so we can expose the inner surface area of the grain where all the starch and enzymes are located to help convert the starch to sugar once we add hot water. The enzymes that convert these starches are water soluble, which is why it's important for us to add water to the grain as we're mashing in. So, we've weighed out all our grain, it's up in the top of the grist case, and now we're finally ready to start mashing. We'll add hot water from our hot liquor tank, and we'll start feeding our grain in, and we'll start hydrating the grain as it goes into our mash lauter tun. As we start mixing the grain and water together, what's going to start happening is those enzymes that are water soluble are going to start activating and start converting the starch to sugar. Once all the malt has been added and all the water's been added, we're going to mix that up, and then we're going to let it sit for about 20 minutes and let it settle and start the conversion process of starch to sugar. This is where wort is actually created. Once we've let it settle out for a little bit, we're actually going to start recirculating the wort from the bottom of the mash tun all the way up over the top, and we're actually going to use the grain bed as a natural filter media. What this is going to achieve is this is going to allow us to actually filter the sugar water or wort and get all the fines and start with something that's relatively cloudy, and we end up with actually something that's relatively clear, which is just really cool and fascinating.
Believe in something.
It takes between about an hour and a half from the time we add the grain and the water to the time we're ready to start running our sugar water or wort off into our boil kettle. The next process involves the process known as sparging. Sparging is where once we start running off the primary extract, sugar extract, into our kettle, we'll actually add more water over the top of the grain bed, and that process is known as sparging. What that sparging process does is that sparging continues to extract sugars from the grain bed. As we start running off, we are continually and diminishingly extracting sugars from the grain bed, and once we have our total sugar concentration that we want to achieve in our boil kettle, then we'll cut that process off and we'll start draining the lauter tun. As we start draining the lauter tun, what we'll do is we'll take our mash out rake, we'll drop that, and then we'll start turning the rakes, open the side manway door. We'll start pushing the grain out into one of our blue mash out bins. Then we'll use our forklift and we'll carry it outside, and then once our spent grain farmer is ready, he'll actually take his trailer, come on down here, pick it up, we'll dump it into his trailer, he'll drive off back to his farm and feed it to all the little happy piggies on the farm, or he'll compost whatever the pigs don't eat. In fact, a lot of people tend to think that most of the spent grain is actually used for animal feed. In reality, you'd have to have a very large farm in order to be able to use all the spent grain that we're producing. So what a lot of farmers, or what a lot of gardening businesses do, is they'll actually end up composting the large majority of the grain that comes from breweries, because there's just so much and you can only use a limited amount as a substitute for feed for livestock.